Take the most sophisticated dish you have ever eaten in your life, the most expensive dinner, the best prepared, with the freshest ingredients. Now try to imagine that none of this, absolutely none of it, existed 2,000 years ago. There was no refrigerator, there was no gas stove, there was no refined sugar, no rice, no potatoes, no tomatoes, no coffee. Half of what you eat today simply did not exist in the biblical world. And yet, people did not just survive. They created a cuisine so ingenious, so full of flavor and meaning, that many of the dishes Jesus ate are still prepared in exactly the same way in Middle Eastern villages today. The question is, what was this food really like? What did things taste like? And most fascinating of all, why does the Bible mention specific foods more than 1,500 times? The answer will completely change the way you read the scriptures. Let's start with the most basic, most sacred, and most present food in the entire Bible, bread. But forget the bread you know. Forget that fluffy white bakery bread with a crunchy crust. The bread of Jesus' time had nothing to do with that. It was flat, dense, and dark. It looked more like a thick tortilla than anything you would buy today. And it was made every single day, every day, because without preservatives, without packaging, without anything, yesterday's bread was already stale. It was almost inedible. The process began before the sun rose. The women of the house, and it was always women's work, took grains of wheat or barley and ground them by hand on grinding stones called a millstone. Two circular stones, one on top of the other, and the woman would turn the top one with force, pouring the grains through the central hole. The sound of the millstone turning was so common in the villages that Jeremiah chapter 25 verse 10 uses the silence of these stones as a sign of total desolation. When the millstone stops turning, life has stopped. This work was brutal. It took 1 to 2 hours a day just to grind enough flour to feed a family, and the flour that came out was not white and fine. It was coarse, irregular, and full of bits of grain husk. When mixed with water and a little salt, sometimes with olive oil, it formed a heavy dough that was flattened by hand on a smooth stone. No rolling pins, no molds. Hands did everything. And the oven? It wasn't an oven. It was a hole in the ground called a tabun, a clay structure shaped like an inverted cone, heated from the inside with dried animal dung or twigs. The dough was stuck to the inner wall of this hot cone, and in a few minutes, the bread was ready. Crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, with that slightly smoky flavor that no modern bakery can replicate. But here is a detail that changes everything. There were two completely different types of bread, and they divided society in half: wheat bread and barley bread. The difference between them was the difference between being rich and being poor. Wheat produced a lighter flour, a lighter bread with a milder flavor. It was the bread of those who had means. Barley, on the other hand, was the grain of the poor, cheaper, more resistant to drought, but it produced a dense, dark bread with a bitter taste that pleased no one who could afford wheat. In Judges chapter 7 verse 13, when a Midianite soldier dreams of a barley loaf rolling down a hill and destroying a tent, the meaning was clear to everyone. The barley represented Gideon, a simple, poor man, insignificant in the eyes of the enemy. And it is no coincidence that in John chapter 6, when Jesus feeds 5,000 people, the text makes a point of specifying that the loaves were made of barley. It was poor man's food feeding a multitude. The message was impossible to ignore. And here is something few Christians realize. When Jesus said, "I am the bread of life" in John, he was not just using a pretty metaphor. He was comparing himself to the food that people ate every day, 3 times a day, without which they would literally die. Bread was not a side dish. Bread was the meal. Everything else, olives, cheese, herbs, was just something to give flavor to the bread. To say "I am the bread" was to say "I am the thing without which you cannot survive." Now, along with bread, The second pillar of the biblical diet was something we use today almost without thinking, which at that time was so valuable it served as currency, medicine, fuel, and a sacred offering. Olive oil. If bread was the body of the meal, olive oil was the blood. It was in absolutely everything. You dipped your bread in oil. You cooked with oil. You fried with oil. You rubbed oil on skin cracked by the sun. You lit your lamps with oil. You anointed kings and priests with oil. In Psalm 23, when David says, "You anoint my head with oil," he isn't just being poetic. Anointing a guest's head with perfumed oil was a real gesture of hospitality, as common as offering a glass of water. The production was fascinating. Olive trees covered the hills of Judea and Galilee, gnarled and knotted trees that lived for centuries, literally centuries. Some of the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane that exist today are over 900 years old, and Gethsemane literally means oil press. Jesus prayed on the night before he died in a place that was, basically, an oil factory. The fruits were harvested in the autumn, between September and November, and taken to enormous stone presses. First, the olives were crushed by a circular stone that rolled over a base, moved by a donkey or by human strength. The resulting paste was placed in fiber baskets stacked on top of each other, and a giant wooden beam pressed everything from the top down. The oil flowed slowly into a stone tank dug into the ground. The first oil that came out from the first pressing without excessive pressure was the purest, the clearest, the most expensive. It was reserved for the temple, for rituals, for the tables of the rich. Subsequent pressings produced oil that was increasingly cloudy and acidic, used for cooking, for lighting, and for those who could not afford the best. Archaeological excavations at Tel Mikne, the ancient Ekron of the Philistines, revealed more than 100 industrial oil presses, a true production line that supplied the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Olive oil was the petroleum of the ancient world. Whoever controlled the olive trees controlled the economy. If this level of detail about biblical food is opening your eyes, like this video now so it can reach more people who need to know this story. Now, the third element of the biblical dietary trinity, and perhaps the most surprising, wine. And before anyone thinks we are talking about grape juice, let's make one thing very clear. Biblical wine was fermented wine with alcohol. The fermentation process was inevitable at that time. Without refrigeration, grape juice began to ferment within hours of being squeezed. There was no practical way to keep grape juice fresh for more than a day or two in the heat of the Middle East. So yes, when the Bible speaks of wine, it speaks of an alcoholic beverage. Proverbs 21 warns that wine is a mocker precisely because it had the power to intoxicate, and it frequently did. But here comes something that will surprise you. The wine people drank daily was not the full-bodied wine you imagine. It was diluted with water. Romans and Jews of the first century mixed 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. Why? Because the available water was often contaminated, untreated, unfiltered, nothing. The alcohol in the wine acted as a purifier. Mixing wine with water was not a luxury, it was survival. When Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy saying, "No longer drink only water, but use a little wine," he is not recommending a glass after dinner. He is giving practical medical advice. Pure water could kill you. Diluted wine kept you alive. Grapes were trodden with feet in stone wine presses, shallow tanks carved into the rock, usually on hilltops near the vineyards. The juice flowed through a channel into a lower tank where it began to ferment naturally with the yeasts present on the fruit's skin. The entire process happened between August and September at harvest time, and the wine press was a place of celebration. Isaiah chapter 16 verse 10 describes how the end of the songs at the wine press was a sign of judgment, because treading grapes was synonymous with joy, abundance, and the community gathered together. Wine was stored in goatskin wineskins or in ceramic jars sealed with beeswax. And now you understand Jesus' parable about new wine in old wineskins in Matthew. New wine was still fermenting, releasing gases, expanding. A new wineskin was flexible, it stretched with the pressure, but an old wineskin was already dried out and rigid. The gas from the new wine would burst the leather, and you would lose both the wineskin and the wine. It wasn't an abstract metaphor. It was something any Galilean peasant had seen happen in their own home. Bread, oil, and wine. That was the base, the unshakable foundation of the biblical diet. But if the meal stopped there, it would be quite monotonous. And the truth is, it didn't stop there. The biblical table was surprisingly varied, much more than most people imagine. But to understand what else appeared on that table, we need to talk about something that defined Jewish eating in a way that no other ancient culture even came close to. The dietary purity laws, the system of kashrut. And this is where biblical food stops being just nutrition and transforms in theology on a plate. Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14 list with surgical precision what could and could not be eaten. Land animals, only those with a split hoof and that chewed the cud. Cow, sheep, goat, permitted. Pig, it had a split hoof but did not chew the cud. Forbidden. Camel, it chewed the cud but did not have a split hoof. Forbidden. Rabbit, same thing. Forbidden. Fish, only those with fins and scales. Tilapia from the Sea of Galilee, permitted. Catfish, eel, shrimp, octopus, any shellfish, forbidden. Birds, the list of forbidden ones included vultures, owls, eagles, ravens, basically birds of prey and scavengers. And here is something fascinating. Modern science has discovered that most of the animals forbidden in Leviticus are precisely the ones that pose the greatest risk of transmitting diseases to humans. The pig is a host for trichinosis. Shellfish without scales accumulate toxins and heavy metals. Scavenger birds carry lethal bacteria. It is impossible not to notice the coincidence, or depending on your faith, the providence. But the most interesting thing is not the list itself, it is the effect it had on daily life. A first-century Jew could not just eat anything they found. Every meal was an act of obedience. Every food that entered the mouth passed through a theological filter. Eating was praying, eating was obeying. Eating was separating oneself from the surrounding peoples who ate everything. And that separation was exactly the point. The word holy in Hebrew, kadosh, literally means separate. The dietary laws were a form of edible holiness. You were separate even at the dinner table. If you never thought that food and faith could be so intertwined, comment, I didn't know. Now that you understand the rules, let's talk about what was actually on the plate. And prepare yourself, because when we look closely at the daily menu of an ordinary family in first-century Galilee, the region where Jesus grew up, the richness of ingredients is impressive. The meals were simple, but they were not meager. A typical family ate twice a day. The first meal was in the morning, light, bread with olives, perhaps a handful of dried figs or dates. The main meal came in the late afternoon, when the sun began to set and the day's work ended. And it was at this meal that the table gained color. Legumes were the protein base for the poor. Lentils, yes, those same lentils, appear in the Bible as far back as Genesis. Esau sold his birthright for a stew of lentils in Genesis. It wasn't just any stew. It was a thick, reddish preparation, seasoned with cumin and coriander, cooked slowly until it became almost a paste. Chickpeas were another essential ingredient, transformed into pastes that are the direct ancestors of the hummus we know today. Fava beans, peas, and common beans complete the arsenal of plant proteins that kept the population on its feet. Vegetables included cucumbers, onions, garlic, and leeks, Numbers. Chapter 11, verse 5 records the Israelites in the desert, crying with longing for exactly these foods they ate in Egypt. We remember the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. This list is not accidental. It is a photograph of what people actually ate and what they truly missed. Fresh herbs were the secret to the flavor: mint, dill, and cumin. Jesus mentions these three in Matthew when he criticizes the Pharisees for tithing even the herbs from the garden but ignoring justice. Coriander, hyssop, wild mustard, thyme. They grew everywhere, on the hillsides, in backyards, between the stones of the paths. Biblical cooking was not bland. It was aromatic, earthy, and alive. If you closed your eyes in a Galilean village at dusk, the smell of onions sautéed in olive oil with cumin and coriander would find you before you found the house. But here comes a question that everyone asks, and the answer is surprising. What about meat? Did Jesus eat meat? Did ordinary Jews eat meat? The answer is yes, but not in the way you imagine. And this is perhaps the greatest contrast between the biblical world and ours. In the modern world, meat is an everyday thing. You eat it at lunch, at dinner, sometimes at breakfast, chicken, beef, pork, fish, every day, every meal. In the biblical world, meat was a luxury, a rare luxury. Most families ate meat only on special occasions, religious festivals, weddings, important visits. A lamb was not just food, it was an investment. A living sheep produced milk, wool, and more sheep. Killing a sheep to eat meant sacrificing a continuous source of income for a single meal. You didn't do that on just any Tuesday. Lamb was the festive animal par excellence, especially at Passover, when each family was to roast a whole lamb according to Exodus chapter 12. The animal was roasted over an open fire on a pomegranate wood spit, never boiled in water according to the explicit instruction of the text. The skin was removed, the entrails cleaned, and the whole lamb went onto the fire with bitter herbs. The smell of fat dripping onto the coals spread throughout all of Jerusalem during Passover. The historian Josephus records that in the 1st century, more than 250,000 lambs were sacrificed in Jerusalem during the festival. 250,000. Imagine the sound, the smell, the scale of that. Fish, on the other hand, was much more accessible, at least for those living near the Sea of Galilee. And it is no coincidence that Jesus chose fishermen as his first disciples. Peter, Andrew, James, and John lived by the fish and for the fish. The most common species was tilapia, still called St. Peter's fish in the region today. It was prepared simply, roasted over coals on the lakeshore, seasoned with salt and herbs. In John chapter 21, the risen Jesus himself prepares this meal for the disciples. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. It is one of the most humanly beautiful scenes in the New Testament, God incarnate cooking breakfast on the lakeshore. Fish was also preserved in salt. The city of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene came from, was famous precisely for its salted fish industry. The name Magdala comes from the Hebrew Migdal, tower, but the city was also known by the Greek name Taricheia, which literally means place of salted fish. The most famous Mary of the New Testament came from a city that smelled of smoked fish. But the part of the biblical diet that most surprises modern people is the sweetness. Because without refined sugar, cane sugar would only reach the Middle East centuries later. How did people satisfy that craving for sweets that every human being has? The answer is honey and fruits. And when the Bible describes the Promised Land as a land flowing with milk and honey in Exodus 3:8, it is not exaggerating. Honey was the sugar of the ancient world. Wild honey collected from hives in rock crevices and tree trunks, that is exactly what John the Baptist ate in the desert, according to Matthew 3:4, wild honey and locusts. But there was also a honey made from dates, a thick, dark, intensely sweet syrup produced by boiling ripe dates in water and reducing the liquid until it became a syrup. Many scholars believe that a large part of the biblical references to honey actually refer to this date syrup, not bee honey. Fruits were abundant and varied. Figs, fresh in summer, dried in winter, were so important that Jesus, cursing a fig tree in Mark chapter 11, was an act of devastating symbolism. Pomegranates, with their hundreds of red seeds, were a symbol of fertility and prosperity. The high priest's robes had pomegranates embroidered on the hem. Fresh grapes, raisins, dates, walnuts, almonds, pistachios. Genesis lists pistachios and almonds among the best products of the land of Canaan, sent as a gift to the governor of Egypt. And here is something that connects everything. Each of these foods, the bread, the oil, the wine, the honey, the fruits, the herbs, the lamb, was not just food. It was language. It was theology. It was identity. When Jesus broke the bread and said, "This is my body," every person in that room understood the weight of it in a way that we, with our industrial meals, can barely grasp. He was taking the most essential thing in their lives, the food their mothers ground with their own hands every day before dawn, and saying, "I am this for you. I am this necessity. I am this daily work. I am this sustenance without which you cannot go a single day." But the bread and wine on the table were only half the story. Because the way people ate, the position of the body, who sat where, what it meant to be invited or excluded from a meal, that was as important as the food itself. And this is the part where most paintings and movies about the Bible get it completely wrong. Forget the image of the Last Supper you have in your head. Leonardo da Vinci painted 13 men sitting in chairs behind a high table, 15th century European style. The reality was radically different. In the 1st century, Jews in Galilee and Judea had already adopted the Greco-Roman custom of reclining while eating, not sitting, reclining. The body lying on its side on cushions or mats on the floor, propped up on the left elbow, with the right hand free to take the food. The table, when there was a table, was low, close to the ground, and the guests were arranged around it in a U-shape, an arrangement called a triclinium. The position in which you reclined said everything about your social status. The most honorable place was to the right of the host. The place to the left was the second most important, and so it went. When Jesus says in Lucas 14:8, "When you are invited to a wedding feast, do not recline in the place of honor," he is talking about a real, concrete situation that happened every week. The fight for positions at the table was constant, and Jesus used that to teach about humility in a way that everyone there understood personally. And it is in this context that the scene in John 13 takes on a completely new dimension. At the Last Supper, the text says that the disciple whom Jesus loved was reclining next to Jesus. If both were reclining in the Roman style, this means that John was literally lying with his back against Jesus' chest. It was a position of extreme intimacy, reserved for the closest friend. It wasn't a formal table with chairs. It was something much more personal, much more human than any Renaissance painting managed to capture. And the food was not on individual plates. This is another error we project from our world onto the ancient world. There were no separate plates for each person. The food was served in large common platters in the center of the table or in the center of the circle of reclining people, and everyone ate from the same platter with their hands. Pieces of bread were used as spoons, dipped into the stew, the oil, the chickpea pastes. When Jesus says in Matthew, "He who dips his hand into the bowl with me will betray me," he is describing the scene literally. Judas was dipping his bread into the same platter as Jesus. This act of eating together from the same plate with the hands was a pact. It was trust. It was communion in the most physical and visceral sense of the word. To betray someone with whom you had broken bread and shared a platter was considered the lowest level of betrayal in Middle Eastern culture, and it remains so today. This is why Judas's betrayal carries a weight that goes far beyond money. He didn't just hand Jesus over, he broke the pact of the table. If you believe that understanding this context completely changes the way we read the Bible, comment, "It changes everything." Now, there was one thing on this table that we need to talk about, and it connects biblical food directly to health, the economy, and even the geopolitics of the ancient world. Salt. It seems simple. It seems irrelevant. But salt in the biblical world was so important that Roman soldiers received part of their payment in salt, and that is where the word salary comes from. Without salt, there was no food preservation. Without preservation, there was no long-distance trade. Without trade, there were no empires. Salt literally sustained civilization. In the region of the Dead Sea, which the ancients called the Sea of Salt, salt concentrations were so high that nothing lived in those waters. But that was exactly what made the region so valuable. Blocks of salt were extracted from the shores and transported in camel caravans throughout Judea and beyond. Salt was used to cure fish, preserve olives, season bread, and, crucial detail, for sacrifices in the temple. Leviticus is categorical. Season all your grain offerings with salt. No sacrifice could go to the altar without salt. It was called the salt of the covenant, because salt preserves and does not corrupt, just like God's covenant with his people. And now Jesus' phrase in Matthew explodes with meaning, "You are the salt of the earth." But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? He isn't making a cute analogy. He is saying, you are what preserves this world from decomposition. You are what gives flavor to an existence that without God is bland. And if you fail in this function, if the salt loses its essence, there is no substitute, there is no plan B. But here comes a technical detail that gives you chills. Dead sea salt was not pure salt. It was a mixture of sodium chloride with other minerals. Over time, exposure to moisture could literally wash away the sodium chloride, leaving behind a white mineral residue that looked like salt, had the appearance of salt, but had no taste at all. It was salt that stopped being salt. When Jesus spoke of salt losing its flavor, he wasn't being metaphorical. He was describing a real chemical phenomenon that anyone who dealt with Dead Sea salt had already witnessed. And the fate of this flavorless salt. It was thrown into the streets as gravel, trampled by men, exactly as Jesus described. Each food, each spice, each way of preparing and serving food in the biblical world carried layers of meaning that we have lost over the centuries. But the ancient table still has much to reveal, because if daily life was like this, bread, oil, legumes, fruit, what happened on feast days was something completely different. The abundance, the extravagance, the banquets that lasted for days. And it is precisely there that one of the most surprising and little-known aspects of biblical cuisine comes in: the biblical banquets. If the daily meal was an act of survival seasoned with faith, the banquet was an explosion of food, of meaning, of politics, of power, and the Bible is full of them. The first great banquet that appears in the scriptures is Abraham's in Genesis chapter 18. When three mysterious visitors appear at his tent, what does Abraham do? He runs. The text is clear. He runs to Sarah and says, "Quick, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he runs to the herd, chooses a tender and good calf, and gives it to a servant to prepare. 3 seahs of flour. That is more than 20 kilograms of dough. For 3 visitors, added to the whole calf, butter, and milk. It was an absurd amount of food, but it wasn't an exaggeration, it was hospitality. In the ancient world, generosity at the table was the measure of a man's honor. To be stingy with food was to be stingy with your own reputation. And when the visitor was unexpected, as in this case, the correct response was to offer the best you had, without hesitation, without calculation. This culture of radical hospitality shaped all banquets in the biblical world. When you were invited to a banquet, you brought nothing. The host provided everything, and everything meant literally everything. At the door, a servant washed your feet, dusty from the road. Another brought perfumed oil to anoint your head and face. This is exactly what Jesus speaks of in Luke when he rebukes the Pharisee Simon. "I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet. You did not put oil on my head." Simon had failed in the most basic protocol of hospitality. He had invited Jesus to eat, but he had not truly received him, and everyone at the table knew it. It was a calculated humiliation, and Jesus exposed publicly. After the washing of the feet and the anointing, the guest was led to his place at the triclinium. And then the food began to arrive, not all at once. A formal banquet followed a sequence. First came the appetizers: seasoned olives, legume pastes, pickled vegetables, fresh bread with olive oil flavored with herbs. Then came the fish dishes, usually roasted or cooked in herb sauces. Then the meat dishes: lamb, goat, sometimes pigeon or quail. And between one dish and another, wine, always wine. A banquet without wine was a contradiction in terms. And speaking of wine, it's time to return to this drink in more depth, because at banquets it played a role that went far beyond quenching thirst. In Greco-Roman banquets, there was the figure of the architriklinos, the master of ceremonies, responsible for deciding the proportion of water and wine in each round. At the beginning of the evening, the mixture was stronger. As the guests became more cheerful and less demanding, the master switched to a weaker, more diluted wine. It was a practical strategy. No one noticed the drop in quality after a few glasses. And it is exactly there that the miracle at Cana in John chapter 2 becomes so shocking. When the wine runs out, a social catastrophe that would shame the groom's family for generations, Jesus transforms water into wine. But not just any wine. The master of ceremonies tastes it and says to the groom, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you have saved the best till now." Jesus didn't just solve the problem. He inverted the logic of the banquet. He offered the best at the moment when everyone expected the worst. And if you understand the dynamics of ancient banquets, you realize that John is not just narrating a supply miracle. He is making a theological statement about the nature of God, a God who saves the best for last, who does not follow the diminishing logic of the world. But banquets were not always a celebration. Sometimes they were traps. Herod's banquet in Mark chapter 6 is one of the darkest episodes in the scriptures. Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee, the same one who ruled the region during Jesus' ministry, held a great banquet for his birthday. The guests were the generals, the officials, the most important men in Galilee. The food was the best that a Roman ruler's money could buy: imported meats, fine wines from Italy, exotic fruits from Egypt. And in the middle of the party, Herodias' daughter danced. And she pleased Herod so much that he promised to give her anything, up to half the kingdom. The quest, instructed by her mother, John the Baptist's head on a platter. The text uses the same Greek word, pinax, that designated the serving dishes for food at the banquet. The head of a prophet served on the same type of utensil used for meat dishes. The obscenity of this image is deliberate. Mark wants you to feel disgust. He wants the most luxurious banquet in Galilee to become the most repulsive. The table that should have been a place of communion became a place of execution. Food and death, side by side on the same plate. And this leads us to one of the deepest and least explored themes of the Bible, the banquet as a metaphor for the kingdom of God. Because Jesus did not use temples, thrones, or armies to describe heaven, he used a table. In Matthew 22, the kingdom of heaven is compared to a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. In Luke 14, Jesus tells the parable of the great banquet. A man prepares a magnificent supper, but the guests make excuses and do not come. So he sends for the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame from the streets and alleys of the city. In Luke, Jesus says, "People will come from east and west, north and south, and will take their places at the feast in the kingdom of God." The image is always the same: a bountiful table, open places, unexpected people being invited, people who normally would not have access to a banquet, the poor, the marginalized, the foreigners, suddenly sitting in the places of honor. It is a complete inversion of the logic of ancient world banquets, where your position at the table reflected your position in society. At Jesus' table, the last would be first. And he didn't just teach this, he practiced it. And this practice caused a scandal, a real, concrete, repeated scandal, because in the first century world, eating with someone was an act of social validation. You didn't eat with just anyone. Eating with someone meant you considered them your equal, or at least acceptable. The Pharisees had very strict rules about whom one could share a meal with. To eat with a public sinner, a tax collector, a prostitute, a Gentile, was to contaminate oneself. It was to destroy your reputation. It was to become impure by association. And what did Jesus do? He ate with everyone. Luke 15, 1-2 records. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Note, the problem was not that Jesus spoke with sinners, it was that he ate with them. The table was the line that was not to be crossed. And Jesus crossed it so many times that his critics defined him by it. In Matthew, they called him a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. It was an insult based on the table. All the criticism was centered on whom and how Jesus ate. And it wasn't just the company, it was the meaning. When Jesus sat at the table with Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19, a chief tax collector, a man the entire society despised, he didn't give a speech about forgiveness. He didn't quote scriptures, he simply said, "I must stay at your house today." And he went to eat. And this act, sitting, reclining, breaking bread, dipping into the same platter, was enough. Zacchaeus understood. The table said what 1,000 sermons would not. You are accepted, you are welcome, you belong. Even before Zacchaeus announced he would pay back 4 times what he stole, Jesus had already declared salvation over his house. The meal came before the public repentance. The open table preceded the moral transformation. This is too radical for most religious cultures even today. And it is at this point that we need to talk about a specific meal. The meal that changed history, the most famous, most represented, most commented on meal in all of Western civilization, and at the same time, perhaps the most misunderstood. The Last Supper. But to understand what really happened in that room in Jerusalem, we first need to understand what the Passover Seder was, the Jewish Passover meal. Because the Last Supper was not just any dinner, it was a Seder, and the Seder was, and still is, the most ritualized, most choreographed, most meaning-laden meal in all of Jewish tradition. Every food on the table had a purpose. Every gesture followed a precise order. Every flavor told a part of the story of the Exodus, the exit from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the passage from slavery to freedom. On the Seder table, there were mandatory elements. The Passover lamb, roasted, never boiled, with bones intact, according to Exodus 12. The bitter herbs, maror, usually horseradish or bitter endive, dipped in a paste called charoseh, made of dates, nuts, apples and wine, which represented the mortar Hebrew slaves used to make bricks in Egypt. The flavor was bittersweet, the bitterness of slavery softened by the sweetness of redemption. It is a culinary masterpiece of edible theology. The unleavened bread, matzah, was thin, flat, without yeast, baked in haste, exactly like the bread the Israelites made on the night of the escape, when there was no time to wait for the dough to rise. 4 cups of wine were served throughout the meal, each corresponding to one of the 4 promises of God in Exodus 6. I will bring you out, I will free you, I will redeem you, I will take you as my own people. And there was a moment in the Seder when the father of the family took the unleavened bread, broke it in half, and hid one half, called the afikoman, to be found by the children at the end of the meal. This broken bread, hidden and then revealed, is exactly the moment when Jesus took the bread and said, "This is my body, which is broken for you." He did not invent a new gesture. He took a gesture that every Jew in that room had already repeated dozens of times throughout their lives and filled it with a meaning none of them expected. The bread that was broken to remember the liberation from Egypt was now broken to announce a greater liberation. The body that would be broken on the cross the next day. And the third cup of wine, the cup of redemption, was the one Jesus raised when he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." It wasn't the first cup, it wasn't the last, it was specifically the third, the cup that corresponded to the promise, "I will redeem you." Every detail was surgical, every gesture was a citation. Every flavor on that table, the bitterness of the herbs, the sweetness of the charosé, the rawness of the unleavened bread, the warmth of the wine, was one layer of meaning superimposed on another, creating a moment of theological density that 2,000 years of theology have still not exhausted. And there is a detail that almost no one mentions. After the third cup, there was a fourth, the cup of consummation, corresponding to the promise, "I will take you as my own people." The Gospels record that Jesus said, "I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." He did not drink the fourth cup. The Seder remained incomplete. The final promise remained suspended, awaiting a future fulfillment at another table, at another banquet. That banquet of which Isaiah 25:6 had already spoken centuries before. "On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines." The Bible begins with food, a forbidden fruit in a garden, and ends with food, a wedding banquet in Revelation. The first act of humanity was to eat what it should not have. The last act of history will be to sit at the table with God. And between these two extremes, every meal recorded in the scriptures, from Abraham serving a calf to strangers to Jesus roasting fish on the lakeshore, is a chapter of this story of a God who chose the table and not the throne as the primary place of encounter with humanity. But if the table was the place of encounter, the kitchen was the place of work. And until now, we have talked about the foods, the banquets, the tables, and the meanings. But we have not yet entered the kitchen itself. Who prepared all this food? How did one cook without a stove, without a refrigerator, without any modern technology? And why does understanding the biblical kitchen reveal one of the greatest silent injustices of the ancient world? The kitchen. Let's talk about it, because when you imagine food preparation in the biblical world, you probably imagine something rustic, but vaguely similar to what we know: a covered area, some kind of counter, organized pots. Erase that image. The kitchen of an ordinary family in first-century Palestine was, in most cases, a corner of the open courtyard. There was no separate room. There was no chimney. There was no counter. There was a tabun, a clay oven in the shape of a cone, about 60 centimeters high, fueled by dried animal dung mixed with straw. Yes, dung. Firewood was a luxury in much of the region. Wood was for construction, for tools, for fences. Using it as daily fuel was a waste few families could afford. So the main fuel was cow or donkey dung, dried in the sun and stored in piles in the courtyards. Ezekiel chapter 4 verse 15 makes a direct reference to this. God allows Ezekiel to use cow dung instead of human dung to bake his bread. The passage is strange to us. To the original audience, it was perfectly understandable. Cow dung was the standard fuel, and the process of cooking was slow, painfully slow. Lighting the tabun took time. Heating it to the right temperature took more time. The bread dough was stuck to the inner wall of the oven, exactly as is still done in the Indian tandoor, which is a direct descendant of these ancient ovens, and baked in a few minutes by radiant heat. But before the bread went into the oven, the flour had to exist. And for the flour to exist, someone had to grind the grain. Every day, without exception. The hand mill, two overlapping circular stones with a central hole through which the grain was poured, was operated manually in a continuous rotating motion that required strength in the arms, back, and shoulders. Jesus mentions this mill in Matthew. Two women will be grinding with a hand mill. One will be taken and the other left. The image is domestic, every day. Two women grinding together in the first light of morning, because grinding grain was the first task of the day. Every day. Grinding enough to feed a family of 6 took between 1 and 2 hours. And this work was done exclusively by women. And here is where we need to be honest about an aspect of the biblical world that we often romanticize. Food preparation was women's work. Without exception, without rotation, without negotiation. Fetching water, women's work. Grinding grain, women's work. Lighting the oven, women's work. Kneading, baking, cooking, serving, cleaning, all women's work. An estimate by archaeologists who studied settlements from the Second Temple period calculates that an ordinary woman spent between 4 and 5 hours a day just on food preparation. This is not counting fetching water, collecting fuel, spinning fabrics, and caring for children. The bodies of these women tell the story. Female skeletons found in excavations in the Levant show a consistent pattern. Severe arthritis in the knees, marked wear on the shoulder and elbow joints, deformations in the fingers. These are the marks of the mill, the oven, the relentless repetition of tasks that began before dawn and only ended after dark. When Proverbs 31 describes the virtuous woman who gets up while it is still night and provides food for her family, it is not describing an option, it is describing an inescapable obligation. And the utensils these women used? They were simple, heavy, and surprisingly efficient. Thick-walled ceramic pots for long cooking, lentils, chickpea stews, vegetable soups that cooked for hours over low heat, shallow iron pans for toasting sesame seeds and spices, narrow-mouthed jars for storing olive oil. The narrow mouth limited exposure to air and slowed oxidation, keeping the oil fresh for months. Large ceramic pots partially buried in the courtyard floor to store grain. The surrounding earth acted as natural thermal insulation, keeping the interior cool even in the brutal Palestinian summer heat. There was no refrigerator, but there was intelligence. Food preservation was an empirical science refined over millennia. Salt to preserve fish and meat. Vinegar to preserve vegetables, sun-drying for fruits, figs, dates, grapes turned into raisins. Olive oil as a sealant in ceramic pots, creating an anaerobic layer that prevented the proliferation of bacteria. Honey as a natural preservative, its low moisture and acidic pH created a hostile environment for microorganisms. Honey pots found in 3,000-year-old Egyptian tombs were still edible when opened by archaeologists, 3,000 years. And there was one utensil that was so essential that the law of Moses specifically protected it: the hand mill. Deuteronomy 24:6 says, "Do not take a pair of millstones, not even the upper one, as security for a debt, because that would be taking a person's livelihood as security." You could pawn clothes, tools, even animals, but not the mill, because without the mill there was no flour. Without flour there was no bread. Without bread, a family died. The mill was literally life. Mosaic legislation recognized this with brutal clarity. Taking a family's mill was a death sentence disguised as an economic transaction, and this law protected indirectly the work of women. It protected the tool without which they could not feed their children. It is one of the most discreet passages of the Pentateuch and one of the most human. Now, let's talk about one last aspect of biblical food that connects everything we have seen so far: fasting. because if eating was an act so laden with meaning in the biblical world, not eating was equally powerful. Fasting appears more than 70 times in the scriptures. Moses fasted 40 days on Mount Sinai. Elijah fasted 40 days in the desert. Jesus fasted 40 days before starting his ministry. Daniel fasted for 21 days. No meat, no wine, no choice food. Esther asked all the Jews of Susa to fast for 3 days before she presented herself to King Xerxes. In each case, fasting was not a diet. It was not a detox. It was a deliberate renunciation of the most basic sustenance of life as a way of declaring total dependence on God. In a world where the next meal was never guaranteed, where hunger was not a metaphor but a real possibility, voluntarily giving up food was an act of courage that we, with our full pantries and delivery apps, can hardly understand. And Jesus reframed fasting in the same way he reframed the table. In Matthew chapter 6, he said, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting." Put oil on your head, wash your face. Exactly the opposite of what was expected. In the ancient world, those who fasted covered themselves in ashes, wore sackcloth, and walked with dirty, downcast faces. It was a public spectacle of piety. Jesus said, "No, fast and look like you aren't fasting." The most radical renunciation should be the most invisible. The relationship with food, eating or not eating, was for Jesus always a matter between the person and God, never a spectacle for the audience. And this is where this 2,000-year-old journey collides with our world. Because when you look at how we eat today, the haste, the isolation, food swallowed in front of screens, solitary meals, abundance that generates not gratitude but anxiety, you realize the size of the abyss that separates us from the biblical table. In the ancient world, every meal was communal. You didn't eat alone. Eating alone was a sign of mourning or social exclusion. Today, more than half of the meals in developed countries are eaten in solitude. In the ancient world, food was received with a blessing. No piece of bread was placed in the mouth without first thanking the God who made the wheat spring from the earth. Today, we eat on autopilot, without noticing what we are chewing, without registering the flavor, without recognizing the chain of hands and work that placed that food on our plate. In the ancient world, the table was the place of belonging. To sit at the table with someone was to say, "You are one of mine." Today we have 1,000 virtual friends and no shared table. And perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all this research is this. In the biblical world, food was never just food. Each grain of wheat ground by tired hands at dawn carried the weight of survival. Each drop of oil pressed from a centuries-old olive tree carried the promise of continuity. Each cup of wine raised at a banquet carried the memory of generations that came before. Each piece of bread broken at the table carried the possibility of communion, the chance to look at another human being and say, without words, "I share what I have with you." And when Jesus chose bread and wine, the most common, most humble, most everyday foods of first-century Palestine, to represent his body and his blood, he was not being random. He was saying that the sacred does not live in the extraordinary, it lives in the ordinary, in the daily bread, in the simple meal, at the table where someone took the trouble to cook for another person. 2,000 years have passed. Clay ovens have become electric stoves. Dung has become natural gas. Hand mills have become industrial machines that process tons of wheat per hour. The olive trees are still there. Some of those same trees that existed in Jesus' time still produce olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. But we have changed. We have more food than any generation in history and less meaning in each meal. We have more options than have ever existed and less presence at the table. We have more knowledge about nutrition than all the doctors of the ancient world combined and less wisdom, about what it truly means to feed oneself. Perhaps it is time to return to the table, not to the first-century table, without romanticism, without nostalgia, without idealization of a past that was also brutal, but to the table as the biblical writers understood it, a sacred place disguised as a common place, a place where food is more than fuel, where company is more than convenience, where breaking bread with someone is the oldest, simplest, and most revolutionary act of humanity that exists. The next time you sit down to eat, today, tomorrow, any day, stop for 3 seconds before the first bite. Look at the plate. Think of the hands that planted, harvested, transported, and prepared what is before you. Think of the women who for millennia woke up before the sun to grind grain and light ovens so their families could survive another day. Think of the table as what it has always been. Not a piece of furniture, but an altar. Not a place of consumption, but of encounter. And if this video changed anything in the way you see food, the Bible, and the table, subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and share with someone who needs to see this. If this video impressed you, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I guarantee it will surprise you even more.